You've heard of monsters, serial killers, psychopaths who haunt our nightmares and fill our true crime documentaries. But what if I told you that one of the most terrifying killers in American history was someone who made children laugh, someone who dressed like a clown, entertained at birthday parties, and even posed for photographs with First Ladies of the United States? This isn't a horror movie. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of John Wayne Gacy, man who lived two lives so completely separate that even today, decades after his execution, psychologists struggle to understand how someone could compartmentalize evil so completely. So, subscribe if you haven't already, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about the people around you. It's a story that proves monsters don't always hide in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they wave at you from their front porch. And sometimes they make you laugh. John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, during the height of World War II. To the neighbors on the north side, the Gacy family seemed unremarkable, working-class Catholic family trying to make ends meet like everyone else. John Sr. worked as a machinist, while Marion, his wife, kept house and raised their 3 children. But appearances, as we'll learn, meant everything to John Wayne Gacy, and behind the closed doors of their modest home on Marmara Avenue, young John's world was being shaped by violence, humiliation, and a desperate need for approval that would eventually twist into something monstrous. John Wayne Gacy Sr. was an alcoholic, not the kind who drank quietly in corners, but the explosive, unpredictable kind. He would come home from work already drunk, his temper ready to ignite at the smallest provocation, and his favorite target was his son, John Jr. The elder Gacy questioned everything about his son's masculinity. When young John showed interest in cooking or gardening, his father called him weak. When he struggled with sports due to a heart condition, his father called him pathetic. When he tried to defend himself, the beatings got worse. The heart condition was real. John Jr. had been born with a congenital defect that caused him to black out during physical exertion. But to his father, it was just another sign of weakness. The boy learned early that the truth didn't matter. Only perception mattered. Only the story you told about yourself mattered. In his teenage years at Prosser High School, Gacy desperately tried to reinvent himself. He joined the Boy Scouts, though he was later expelled for inappropriate conduct with other boys. He ran for class president and lost. He volunteered at church events, always trying to be seen, always trying to be liked, always trying to prove he was worthy of love. After high school, Gacy's life became a series of false starts and reinventions. He briefly attended Northwestern Business College, but dropped out. He sold shoes, worked in construction, tried his hand at various jobs, always charming his way in, always finding ways to make people like him, but never quite finding his place. Then, in 1964, something seemed to change. At age 22, Gacy married Marlyn Myers, a co-worker from a clothing company where they both worked. Marlyn came from a respectable family. Her father owned several Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises in Iowa. Here was Gacy's chance at the normal life he'd always craved. The couple moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where Gacy took over managing one of his father-in-law's KFC restaurants. And suddenly, John Wayne Gacy was exactly what he'd always wanted to be: successful, respected, part of a community. He joined the local JCs, a civic organization for young men. He organized charity events. He was everything a small town could want in a young businessman. To his wife, he was devoted, bringing her flowers, planning romantic dinners, talking about their future together. To his in-laws, he was the golden son they'd never had. To the community, he was a pillar of society. But beneath the surface, something was stirring, something dark. because late at night, when the restaurant was closed and his wife was asleep, Gacy began inviting teenage boys to his basement. Boys who worked at the restaurant, boys from the neighborhood, boys who needed money and weren't afraid of a little extra work. He told them he could help them make easy money. He told them he could teach them about business. He told them many things. But what he did to them in that basement, that's when we first see the monster beginning to emerge. In 1968, the mask slipped for the first time. Gacy was arrested and charged with sexually assaulting Donald Voorhees, a 15-year-old boy. But even then, even facing serious charges, Gacy's ability to manipulate and charm nearly saved him. He convinced some people he was being framed. He painted himself as the victim. The jury didn't believe him. He was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But here's the thing about John Wayne Gacy. He was a model prisoner, charming, helpful, always volunteering for extra duties. He even managed the prison kitchen. And after serving just 18 months of his 10-year sentence, he was released on parole. When Gacy walked out of that Iowa prison in June 1970, something had changed. He smiled the same charming smile. He told the same engaging stories. But his eyes had grown colder. His charm had grown more calculated. And his ability to wear a mask, to be exactly what people wanted him to be, had been. Gacy moved back to Chicago and bought a house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township. It was a modest ranch-style home in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood, exactly the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and children played safely in the streets. He started PDM contractors, painting, decorating, and maintenance, and the business thrived. Gacy was good with people, good at selling himself, and surprisingly good at managing crews of young workers. He hired teenagers and young men, many of them runaways or kids from troubled homes who were grateful for steady work and a boss who seemed to care about them. But construction was just one of Gacy's pursuits. He threw himself into local Democratic politics, organizing fundraisers, volunteering for campaigns, networking with city officials. He was ambitious, determined to climb the social ladder he'd been knocked off of so many times before. And it worked. Gacy's charm opened doors. He met mayors, congressmen, even First Lady Rosalynn Carter, with whom he posed for a photograph that would later become one of the most chilling images in true crime history. A serial killer smiling beside the president's wife, both of them completely unaware of the monster hiding behind that grin. But perhaps Gacy's most famous persona was yet to come. In the early 1970s, he created Pogo the Clown, a character he developed to entertain at children's birthday parties and charity events. He spent hours perfecting the costume, the makeup, the routine. Pogo wore a blue and red outfit with white ruffles, and his face was painted in a way that made his mouth appear to extend beyond his lips in a perpetual, exaggerated smile. Children loved Pogo. Parents thought the clown routine was endearing. Here was this successful businessman who cared enough about his community to dress up and make kids laugh for free. Gacy performed at street fairs, political events, and private parties. He even appeared on local television shows. Back on Summerdale Avenue, Gacy was the perfect neighbor. He threw elaborate backyard barbecues where he'd cook for dozens of people. He helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. He shoveled snow from sidewalks without being asked. When people needed work done on their homes, they called Gacy. He was reliable, affordable, and always pleasant to deal with. But there was another side to Gacy's life that his neighbors never saw. The young men who worked for him, the runaway teenagers the boys who were drawn to his offers of easy money and steady work. Some of them started disappearing. At first, nobody connected the disappearances to Gacy. These were often street kids, runaways, young men from broken homes who moved around frequently anyway. When they vanished, people assumed they'd moved on to another city, another opportunity, another chance at life. But they hadn't moved on. They were right there, beneath the feet of everyone who attended Gacy's barbecues, buried in the crawl space under his house. Because, while Gacy was perfecting his public personas, the successful businessman, the community volunteer, the entertaining clown, he was also perfecting something else entirely. He was perfecting murder. Gacy's method was disturbingly consistent, refined through repetition like any other skill. He would lure his victims, almost always young men, between the ages of 14 and 20, to his house, with promises of work, drugs, or easy money. Once they were inside, once they were comfortable, he would offer them a drink, sometimes laced with chloral hydrate to make them drowsy and compliant. Then came what Gacy called the handcuff trick. He would produce a pair of handcuffs and demonstrate how easily he could slip out of them, making it look like magic. "Your turn," he would say with that same charming smile that had fooled so many people for so many years. But when it was their turn, the trick ended. The smile vanished. The mask finally dropped, and the real Gacy emerged, a predator who fed on power, control, and the absolute terror of his victims. The boys would find themselves handcuffed, gagged, and completely at the mercy of a man who had none. What happened next was unspeakable. Gacy would torture his victims for hours, sometimes days. He used ropes, boards, and his bare hands to strangle them. Some victims were sexually assaulted. Others were forced to endure psychological torture, as Gacy described what he was going to do to them. Many begged for their lives. None were spared. When the torture ended, when his victims finally died, Gacy faced the problem of disposal. But he had already thought of that. Beneath his house was a crawl spacer, narrow area between the foundation and the floor, originally designed for access to plumbing and electrical systems. It was dark, cramped, and perfect for hiding bodies. Gacy would drag the bodies into the crawl space and bury them in shallow graves, sometimes stacking them 2 or 3 deep when space became limited. He poured lime over the corpses to accelerate decomposition and mask the smell, but it wasn't enough. The odor of decay began to permeate the house and even drift outside. Neighbors began to complain about a terrible smell coming from Gacy's property. When confronted, he had ready explanations: dampness in the crawl space, dead rodents, problems with the plumbing. His responses were so confident, so reasonable, that people accepted them without question. After all, this was John Wayne Gacy, the successful businessman, the community volunteer, the man who made children laugh. But the crawl space was filling up. By 1978, Gacy had buried 29 bodies beneath his house. 29 young lives, ended in the most horrific way imaginable, hidden just feet below where he entertained guests, cooked meals, and planned his next community service project. When the crawl space could hold no more, Gacy began dumping bodies in rivers around Chicago, the Des Plaines River, the Illinois River, anywhere he could drive late at night and dispose of evidence without being seen. But even then, he preferred the crawl space. There was something about having his victims close by, under his control, even in death, that satisfied his need for dominance. And through it all, Gacy maintained his double life with remarkable discipline. By day, he was the successful contractor, the community leader, the entertaining clown. By night, he was a predator, stalking Chicago's most vulnerable young men. The compartmentalization was so complete that even people who knew him well saw no signs of the monster lurking beneath the surface. But bodies have a way of demanding justice. Families of missing young men began to pressure police for answers. The disappearances were adding up, and some investigators began to notice patterns. Many of the missing had last been seen in areas where Gacy worked or lived. Everything changed on December 11, 1978. because of a 15-year-old boy named Robert Pierce. Unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, Robert came from a stable, loving family. He was a good student, worked part-time at a pharmacy, and had plans for his future. He was exactly the kind of kid who gets noticed when he doesn't come home. That evening, Robert told his mother he was going to meet a contractor about a job that would pay much better than his pharmacy work. The contractor had come into the pharmacy earlier, talking about opportunities for young, hard-working men. Robert was excited about the possibility of making extra money for Christmas presents. When Robert didn't come home that night, his family immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't a boy who stayed out without calling. This wasn't a teenager who would worry his parents unnecessarily. Elizabeth Pierce called the pharmacy, called Robert's friends, called everyone she could think of. No one had seen him since he left to meet the contractor. The next morning, the Pierces filed a missing person report. The police, accustomed to dealing with runaway teenagers, initially weren't overly concerned, but the Pierces were persistent, and one detail caught investigators' attention. The contractor Robert had gone to meet. Detectives traced the contractor lead back to the pharmacy and discovered that earlier that day, a man had been there talking to the manager about a remodeling job. That man was John Wayne Gacy. When police contacted Gacy, he was cooperative, even helpful, too helpful, some investigators thought. Gacy claimed he had never met Robert Pierce, had never offered him a job, had never even been to the pharmacy on December 11th. But there were witnesses who said otherwise, and Gacy's story had small inconsistencies that made detectives suspicious. They began watching his house, following his movements, building a case. On December 13, 1978, police obtained a search warrant for Gacy's property. They were looking for evidence connecting him to Robert Pierce's disappearance. They expected to find maybe some personal items, perhaps signs of a struggle. They had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. The search began in the house itself. Officers found a class ring that didn't belong to Gacy, a high school jacket that wasn't his size, and a receipt from the pharmacy where Robert Pierce worked. But it was the smell that really caught their attention, a sickly, sweet odor of decay that seemed to permeate the entire house. One of the investigators decided to check the crawl space. Armed with flashlights, he crawled into the narrow space beneath the house. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Wrapped in plastic bags, covered with lime, buried in shallow graves throughout the crawl space, were human remains. Lots of human remains. The discovery set off one of the largest crime scene investigations in Chicago history. Teams of forensic experts, coroners, and detectives worked around the clock to carefully excavate the crawl space. Body after body was uncovered, each one representing a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future that would never be. News of the discovery spread quickly, and soon Gacy's house was surrounded by media vans, curious neighbors, and horrified onlookers. The story dominated local and national news. The man who had seemed so normal, so successful, so caring, was revealed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. When police arrested Gacy, he didn't flee or resist. He was calm, almost relieved. During interrogation, he confessed with a casualness that chilled even experienced detectives. He referred to his victims as his boys, and described their murders as if he were discussing the weather. The final count was 33 victims, 26 buried in the crawl space, 3 buried elsewhere on his property, and 4 found in rivers around Chicago. Each number represented a human being with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. The youngest was just 14 years old. Gacy's trial began in 1980, and it captivated the nation. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded killer who had carefully planned and executed dozens of murders. The defense argued that he was insane, that no sane person could commit such atrocities, but the jury saw through Gacy's final performance. On March 13, 1980, John Wayne Gacy was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row, giving interviews, painting pictures, and maintaining his innocence to anyone who would listen. On May 10, 1994, he was executed by lethal injection. His final words were, "Kiss my ass," defiant and cruel to the very end. Gacy's house on Summerdale Avenue was demolished shortly after the bodies were discovered. The crawl space was filled in, the lot was cleared, and eventually a new house was built on the site. But for the families of the victims, for the community that had been deceived, and for society as a whole, the horror could never be completely erased. So what do we learn from John Wayne Gacy? We learn that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. It doesn't always come with a warning label or a threatening appearance. Sometimes evil wears a smile. Sometimes it shakes your hand at community events. Sometimes it makes your children laugh. The clown killer reminds us that trust, while necessary for society to function, can be dangerous when given too freely, that appearances can be deceiving, and that monsters are often the people we least suspect, the neighbors we wave to, the businessmen we respect, the volunteers we admire. Don't forget to like this video. If it opened your eyes to the darker side of human nature, subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases that changed how we understand evil. And remember, when someone seems too good to be true, when their charm feels just a little too perfect, trust your instincts. Because John Wayne Gacy is gone. But there are others out there, hiding behind masks of respectability, waiting for their chance to strike. The best defense we have is knowledge, awareness, and the courage to look beyond the surface. Stay safe out there.